Okay, so when we talk about the ovaries, these are examples of gonads, and these are actually homologous in terms of coming from the same embryonic origin to the testes. The testes, I mentioned, are located outside of the body cavity, but the ovaries remain in the body cavity, and they're in the pelvic region, and they're protected by the pelvic girdle. So when we look at the location of the ovaries, we can see that they're rather low in the pelvic abdominal region. And something very interesting about the ovaries is that they are not directly connected to the uterine tube, or to, sometimes you probably have heard this referred to as the fallopian tube. And so when we look at the ducts, they are not homologous between males and females. And this might explain why there is not a direct connection between the ovary and the uterine tube. So in embryonic development, we can see that we start off, interestingly, as an undifferentiated embryo. It's indifferent at 5 to 6 weeks. So we haven't determined whether the embryo is going to become male or female. And so you can see here that this is the ovary or the gonad that could either become the testes or the ovaries. So this is my undifferentiated gonad. This is actually part of the kidney. The kidney is very strange embryologically. And then you'll notice that there's 2 sets of ducts. So in the male, if the Y chromosome is present, then the gonad will start to produce testosterone, and testosterone is what causes that early embryonic differentiation. So that testosterone turns the internal genitalia male. And so one of the things that happens is that the mesonephric duct is maintained, and the paramesonephric duct actually degenerates. And you'll notice that the mesonephric duct is the one that is closest to the gonad. And there's like a direct connection there. When we look at the ovaries, this would be if testosterone levels are not high, there is no Y chromosome. The Mullerian or the perimesonephric duct is the one that is maintained, and this mesonephric duct disintegrates. And notice that that's the close one. This is the one that's furthest away. And so the ovary is not directly connected. And so when ovulation happens, sometimes that egg ends up in the peritoneal cavity and doesn't actually ever make it into the female's reproductive system, interestingly. And in rare cases, fertilized eggs and embryos have actually passed the wrong way out of the duct and have gotten into the body cavity and adhered to organs. And so that is actually an example of an ectopic pregnancy. So the ovaries are not directly connected to the uterine tube. So we'll write that down. Not directly connected to the uterine tubes. The ovaries also contain follicles. And so the primordial follicle, that's an I, primordial, let me fix that. Primordial follicle is present at birth. And in another lecture, I talked about oogenesis and how it is discontinuous. So there are stages that become arrested. And so the primordial follicle, the oocyte, is arrested in prophase 1 of meiosis 1. So the ovaries respond to the production of 2 hormones, the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And these are produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary. So the ovaries are regulated by anterior pituitary hormones. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. We talked about this as it relates to the regulation of male reproductive cycles. And FSH, remember, in the male actually stimulates spermatogenesis. Then we have LH, so that's luteinizing hormone. So these are produced. So the thing about the FSH that you need to know is that FSH stimulates a follicle to continue to develop. So follicular development. Every month. So that follicle is going to start to develop, and maybe a couple might start to develop, but there's going to be a dominant follicle. Now, if you have twins where you're releasing 2 eggs or multiple eggs, or you are taking fertility drugs that are called superovulatory drugs, then that means that you're going to mature more than one follicle. So sometimes, you might ovulate 8 eggs. They might take those eggs out of you and then fertilize those eggs with sperm and then put embryos back in you in fertilization treatments. Okay, so generally it's just one dominant follicle every month. So the LH, on the other hand, tends to coincide, a burst of LH tends to coincide with ovulation. So a burst of LH coincides with ovulation. So ovulation is the release of the egg from the ovary. So when we talk about follicular development, there's a couple of things that we need to know. The cells that directly surround the developing oocyte are called granulosa cells. And initially in the primordial follicle, there's just a single layer of granulosa cells. But as the follicle develops, the granulosa cells are going to multiply. So they're going to undergo mitosis, and you're going to get a thicker layer of granulosa cells. So the granulosa cells undergo mitosis and develop a thick layer, just multi-layer as the follicle develops. Now, outside of the granulosa cells, there is connective tissue cells that are kind of interesting. They form what is called the theca folliculi. So outer layer is the theca folliculi. So these are I'll show you a picture in a minute, but these cells produce androgens. So androgens, when you look at that, andro means male. So male generating, like testosterone, right, is an androgen. They produce androgens that are then converted to a type of estrogen called estradiol by the granulosa cells. So as the follicle develops, it's going to produce more and more estrogen. So the follicle produces the estrogen inside of the ovary. So if we look at a diagram of this follicular development, we can see that there's these little places in here. These are the primordial follicles. And as the follicle develops, this would be like an oocyte right here. This would be the layer of granulosa cells, and then this is the theca folliculi. So this is kind of a cross section. So like this one is a follicle, and a very enlarged follicle, but the cross section through it actually doesn't show the oocyte. So let's see if we can find a better picture of that. Okay, this is a better picture. Okay, so the primordial follicles, prophase 1, you are born with them. every month, one is chosen as the dominant follicle. And so the female, the oogenesis is going to proceed through meiosis one. So it's going to complete meiosis one. This is called the primary follicle. The secondary follicle, it has a layer of granulosa cells that are shown right here. And this is maybe a better picture. So down here, you can see the oocyte, and then you have the granulosa cells, a thick layer. And then around the outside, you have the theca folliculi. Now, the primary oocyte is going to continue to develop, and it's going to develop into a secondary oocyte, which is arrested in metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. So we talked about that when we talked about oogenesis. So the secondary follicle, you need to know, there is a fluid-filled space called the antrum. So the antrum is a fluid-filled space that is going to form a cyst on the surface of the ovary. And when that cyst ruptures, the oocyte is going to be propelled out of the ovary, out of the ovary. So let's talk about a little bit more detail about the secondary oocyte. So let's go to topic, whiteboard. Okay, so we develop a secondary oocyte. Let's write this down. Okay, it has a fluid-filled antrum. What else does it have? It is an oocyte that is arrested in metaphase 2. Metaphase 2 will not be completed unless fertilization occurs. So the oocyte arrested in metaphase 2. Now, around the oocyte is a kind of a glycoprotein layer. So around the oocyte is a barrier called the Zona Pellucida. So the Zona Pellucida, it's kind of like a membrane. It's composed of glycolipids, or excuse me, glycoproteins. We could put shell surrounding the oocyte. And this is something that the sperm is going to have to break through in order for fertilization to be accomplished. So that's the Zona Pellucida. So upon ovulation, the oocyte, surrounded by granulosa cells, is released. Now, these granulosa cells that are released with the oocyte have kind of a cool name. They are called the corona radiata. So think about radiating crown that surrounds the oocyte. So let's go back to that picture of our ovary. So we have the, they show the Zona Pellucida. This is that glycoprotein-like structure that's going to form a barrier. And then we have this layer of granulosa cells that are going to be here. And those are also going to be a barrier to fertilization. And do we have a, let's see, I guess it's cut off, but in your book, you can look at this. Okay. So the last thing that we need to talk about is what happens to the cells that are left behind in the ovary. So this is what these show, the granulosa cells right here. So the leftover granulosa cells become the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is actually really important. It's the yellow body. And this corpus luteum is going to produce hormones. So it produces estrogen and progesterone. And this is important because this maintains the lining of the uterus until it is determined whether or not you are pregnant or not, if you're a female. So maintains the lining of the uterus. Okay. So let's say pregnancy doesn't happen, then that corpus luteum is going to degenerate and it turns into like something that's called the corpus albicans. So it's the white body now, and it's like scar tissue. It just kind of stays in the ovary. And when it degenerates, your estrogen and progesterone levels fall. And so menstruation is going to occur if the corpus luteum degenerates. So these are the structures that you need to be able to identify and know their function in terms of the structure of the ovary and the roles that it plays in regulating the uterine cycle.